Hi everybody, and welcome to part 3 of our series, The Making of a King, our studies through 1 Samuel. Welcome to your community group tonight. Now we pick up our story this evening in 1 Samuel chapter 2, from verse 11. The background to that is that it follows on from the Song of Hannah, which celebrated God's wise rule in history and invoked his blessing on the coming monarchy, the Anointed One. The storyline moves from there now back to before the rise of the kingship, and picks up the life of Samuel, the son that had been born to Hannah in miraculous circumstances and situation, and also the house of Eli. Now Eli was the priest at that time, and he was the high priest, and he had 2 sons, which are mentioned in chapter 1, verse 3, and we pick up here now, Hophni and Phinehas. Everything that happens in the rest of Samuel really flows out of chapters 1 and 2, in the sense that you have this incredible account of the birth of this boy Samuel to Hannah. And her prayers really, in many respects, are prayers that change the world. In chapter 1, she prays this prayer and asks God for a son, and he grants that prayer. In chapter 2, the prayer is a thanksgiving and praise to God for answering her prayer and for giving her that son. And really what that's trying to do is to get us to focus in on Samuel. There's something special about this child. Hannah and Elkanah now fall away, and Samuel begins to come to the fore. But even in this section, he's still in the background, because the narrator is trying to put across another point. He needs us to understand what the situation in Israel is at that point in time. The people who were meant to be interceding on behalf of the nation of Israel to God were thoroughly corrupt. They were greedy, they were gluttons, they were lazy. They took more than what was required, more than their fair share. They did it by force, if it was necessary. What's more is that they practiced sexual morality with a number of the women in Israel at the gates of the tabernacle. And so you begin to get this picture that is all too familiar with us when it comes to people that have positions of power. They become corrupt. The point is that it's meant to be incredibly shocking, because these are God's special people. This is the people at that time in the world, the only people that had God's self-revelation, that had God's law, that actually had God dwelling with them in the tabernacle at Shiloh. To compound matters, the high priest, Eli, didn't do anything about it. Yes, there is the section where he goes and he speaks to his sons, and he tries to tell them that they need to stop, but he really falls far short of doing that, in 2 respects. Firstly, his sons don't stop. And secondly, a prophet comes in verses 27 to 36 and speaks God's word to Eli. And that word says to Eli that he honors his sons above the Lord. And ultimately saying, look, you don't honor the Lord, Eli, because you put your sons, because you put your family before me. And so God's word to Eli's house is that judgment is going to befall that house. And it's a horrible judgment. And it goes to show what will happen to those who have no regard for the Lord, those that hold the sacrifice of the Lord in contempt. Now, an interesting aside there is that the same is true today. God's sacrifice is Jesus. He's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And to hold Jesus into contempt, to have no regard for that sacrifice, is to turn our back on God's way of salvation. The only thing that can make us right with God, the only thing that can forgive our sins, the only thing that can restore us and redeem us back into a relationship with God. In other words, Hophni and Phinehas are a perfect picture, a living illustration of what will happen to all those who turn their back on the grace of God. But what we need to understand is that in the background of the story, or what appears to be the background of the story, something big is going on. Remember, chapter 1 and 2 sets the scene for us to keep our eyes on Samuel. So what's happening with Samuel? Well, he appears 4 times in the story. You can look up those verses yourselves, and you need to ask yourself, what is it that he's doing? What's going on? The clue is that he's growing. He's practicing the things that a priest was meant to practice. He is an example of someone who holds the Lord in high regard and who doesn't show contempt for God's sacrifice. Even the little clues that the writer gives about what he's wearing is in contrast to Hophni and Phinehas. He was wearing the priestly garments, and he was functioning in a priestly role, in complete contrast to what Hophni and Phinehas were doing. Our biggest clue is that chapter 2, verse 26, that grew in stature with God and men. In other words, Samuel grew in his relationship with the Lord. That's really important because that, again, highlights for us that what God is doing and what God is going to do in bringing about leadership in the nation of Israel is tied to Samuel. So we need to keep our eyes on him. Now the interesting thing is that in Luke chapter 2, the exact same phrase is used of Jesus, that Jesus grew in stature with God and with men. The same is true with Jesus. He's at the center of everything that God's doing. And yet oftentimes in this world we think that maybe he's in the background. What's he really doing? In our lives, we can put him into the background and say, it doesn't really make a difference Monday to Friday or Monday to Saturday. It doesn't really make that big a difference at all. The point that the writer is making with Samuel is we've got to keep our eyes fixed on him if we want to understand what God's doing. The reality is that what a passage like this teaches us about God is that God is always at work, accomplishing his purposes and bringing about his grace in spite of human wickedness and evil and efforts to stop it. God's grace will conquer, it will win. And so even though God is silent, or quiet in this case, it doesn't mean he's any less at work, accomplishing his purposes. The same can be said about Jesus. Jesus isn't in the background, he's in the foreground. Our call is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and then sat down at the right hand of God the Father. The application of that verse is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. If we want to know what God's doing in Samuel, we look at Samuel. If we want to know what God's doing in the world, well, we actually look at Jesus, and we keep our eyes fixed on him. And we understand that when God seems to be quiet in our lives or in our world, it doesn't mean that he's any less at work. God will accomplish all of his purposes. He will accomplish his grace. And that's the incredible thing in 1 Samuel, is that even though there's this terrible word of judgment against Eli's house, and you think, well, if he removes the priests, then what? Will his presence be removed? There's always these little hints of grace that God is raising up somebody else. And so too, God has raised up Jesus. And the implication of that for us is that actually, when everything else is going on in our lives, are we keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus? Is he central? Is he king? Do I love Jesus through all the things in my life? The good and the bad. When it's hard and when it's easy. Is he the central thing? Because if we don't keep our eyes fixed on him, we're not going to know what God's doing. We're not going to be ready to listen to God. We're not going to see God working in our lives. Perhaps one or two of you would like to share something that's happened in your life where God was quiet, God was silent, you didn't know what God was doing, but at the end of a set of circumstances, you can look back and you can say, yes, I see that God was at work, and this is what he was doing in my life, and this is how it was ultimately for my good, because I know that God is working all things together for the good of those who love him and who call upon his name. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time together this evening, and looking forward to seeing you on Sunday for part 4 in our series, What Happens When God Speaks.